The will trembled in my hands, the ink still fresh. My son's name printed beside the word deceased. Outside, rain whispered against the courthouse window, soft and relentless, like it knew something I didn't. Across the table, my daughter-in-law smiled, too quickly, too politely, as if grief were a performance she'd already rehearsed. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes the calmest faces hide the darkest truths. The lawyer's voice faded into static as he read the next line. The farmhouse now belongs to you, Mrs. Lewis. That was the moment the silence around my son's death began to make sense. Let me show you how it all began. When the lawyer slid the papers across the desk that afternoon, I remember staring at the farmhouse address like it was written in another language. My name was typed cleanly across the top, Margaret Lewis, and underneath it, the words sole beneficiary. Ethan's farmhouse, the one he bought just before everything ended, now belonged to me. I should have felt something like comfort, or maybe closure. But instead, there was this hollow ache in my chest, and a quiet whisper that something wasn't right. Ethan had only been gone a few weeks. Everyone kept calling it an accident, like saying it out loud enough times might make it true. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the last tremor in his voice on the phone that night. That heaviness he tried to hide. It didn't sound like a man who was about to die. And then there was Lila. She didn't shed a single tear during the private service she arranged. I remember how tightly she gripped her phone, how she avoided my eyes as if she was waiting for something, or someone. When the lawyer mentioned the inheritance, she froze, just for a second, and then forced a smile that never reached her eyes. Maybe grief makes you see ghosts where there aren't any. Maybe I was just a lonely mother trying to make sense of the senseless. But deep down, I felt it. A quiet pulse beneath the stillness. Ethan's death wasn't random. I kept thinking about that farmhouse, sitting out there on the edge of Maple Hollow, surrounded by empty fields and silence. It was the last place he'd lived, and maybe the only place where the truth still lingered. So I made up my mind. I was going to pack a small bag and drive there myself. Whatever secrets waited inside that farmhouse, I needed to face them. Not just for Ethan, but for me. The funeral didn't feel like a farewell. It felt like a performance. The church was small, the lights too bright for the kind of day it was. Only a few people came, mostly Lila's friends, dressed in black that looked freshly bought. I sat in the front pew alone, staring at the closed casket, wondering if Ethan was really inside. Lila stood by the altar, dabbing her eyes at precise moments, her face a careful blend of sorrow and poise. Not once did she look my way. It was as if I'd become invisible the moment my son took his last breath. When the pastor spoke, his words felt hollow, as though he was reading about a stranger. There were no stories about Ethan's laugh, or how he used to fix old radios with his bare hands when he was 10. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone who he really was, but the words stuck somewhere deep in my throat. I'd never felt so quiet, so unwanted, in a room meant for goodbye. A few days later, the lawyer called us in. Lila sat across from me in her beige coat, her nails tapping the table like she was keeping time to a song only she could hear. The lawyer read the will slowly, his voice steady and professional. Lila inherited everything: the savings, the house, the cars. Then he looked at me and said, "I had one thing, the old farmhouse on Willow Creek Road." That name, it hit me like a memory half buried under dust. Ethan had bought that place a few years ago, said he wanted to fix it up someday. I hadn't thought much of it then, just another one of his quiet projects. But why would he leave it to me? Why only that for the next few nights? I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house felt like a whisper. I kept picturing that farmhouse, the peeling paint, the long driveway lined with oak trees, the upstairs window that always looked dark in the photos. Something about it called to me, like Ethan had left a piece of himself there waiting to be found. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was madness. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't rest until I saw it with my own eyes. So I decided I would drive to Willow Creek Road in the morning. Whatever answers waited in that farmhouse, I was finally ready to face them. The road to Willow Creek felt longer than I remembered. The farther I drove, the more the city behind me dissolved into open land. Miles of fields swaying in the wind, barns leaning tiredly against the horizon, and telephone poles that seemed to march endlessly into nowhere. The silence out there had a weight to it, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I kept the radio off. I wanted to hear the hum of the tires on gravel, the rhythmic heartbeat of the car as it carried me toward the last place my son ever lived. By the time I turned onto the dirt driveway, the late afternoon light had already begun to thin. The farmhouse stood in the middle of a wide, overgrown field, its white paint blistered from the sun, shutters hanging crooked. The air smelled of pine and old rain. I sat for a moment, just staring at it, that feeling in my chest, a mix of grief and recognition, pulling me backward in time. I could almost see Ethan at 12 years old, running barefoot through the yard, laughing as he built something out of scraps and wire. He always liked fixing broken things. Maybe that's why he bought this place. When I finally stepped inside, the air was thick with dust and stillness. The floorboards groaned softly beneath my shoes. Light filtered in through half-drawn curtains, slicing the dimness into pale ribbons. On the kitchen counter, a mug sat beside the sink, a faint ring of coffee dried inside. I ran my hand over it and froze. It was still warm. The chair by the window faced the driveway, angled just slightly, as if someone had been watching for a car to arrive. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor had checked in after Ethan died. Maybe the realtor came by. But the lie didn't convince even me. As I walked through the rooms, memories began stitching themselves into the silence. The faded wallpaper, the cracked photo frame, the faint smell of motor oil in the hallway. It was all Ethan. But there was something else here too. Something uneasy. In the living room, an old workbench had been pushed against the wall, scattered with tools, papers, and a half-open notebook. I hesitated before picking it up. Inside, Ethan's handwriting filled the pages, numbers, dates, short notes that didn't make sense at first. But then I noticed the pattern. License plate numbers, each line carefully marked with times and locations, some repeated over and over. A chill ran through me. My first thought was that he'd been paranoid, maybe documenting strangers, maybe watching someone. But the more I looked, the more I saw her name scribbled in the margins. Lila. He'd been watching her. I sank into the old chair, my heart pounding. Suddenly, the farmhouse didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched, as if the walls themselves had seen too much and were waiting for me to catch up. For the first time since Ethan's death, grief took a different shape inside me. It wasn't just sorrow anymore. It was purpose. Whatever had driven my son to write down those numbers. It hadn't been madness. It had been fear, or maybe truth. Night had begun to fall when I realized I couldn't leave. Not yet. The farmhouse had more to say, and I was finally ready to listen. I turned off the light, locked the door, and decided to stay. Tomorrow, I'd search every inch of this place. Ethan left me something here, and I was going to find it. Night fell heavy over the farmhouse, like a blanket soaked in secrets. The air felt different once the sun disappeared, colder, thicker, full of the kind of silence that presses on your chest until you can hear your own heartbeat. I'd lit a small lamp in the living room, the kind that hummed faintly when the bulb warmed up, but it barely pushed back the darkness. Every sound, the ticking of the clock, the soft groan of the wood, made me feel as though the house was breathing with me. I should have been sleeping, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. The notebook still sat on the table, its pages open, the ink slightly smeared like Ethan had written in a hurry. I ran my fingers across the paper again and again, searching for something I'd missed. That's when I heard it, a faint hollow sound beneath my feet, a subtle difference in the creak of the floorboards. Kneeling down, I brushed aside the old rug, exposing the warped wood underneath. One plank was loose along the edge, the nails slightly raised. My hands trembled as I pried it up, the old wood giving way with a tired sigh. Inside the hollow space was a small metal box, scuffed and rusted, but still locked. It took me a few minutes to force it open with a screwdriver from the workbench. Inside were photographs, documents, and a few memory cards sealed in plastic. I pulled out the first photo, a grainy shot of Lila standing beside a black sedan, talking to a man I didn't recognize. The next photo showed her outside a warehouse, handing off what looked like a stack of envelopes. Beneath the photos were papers, bank statements, transaction records, even a contract bearing Lila's signature tied to a shell company I'd never heard of. The names on the papers sent a chill through me. Some of them I recognized from the news. Men arrested years ago for fraud, extortion. Worse. My breath caught in my throat. Ethan had been investigating her. My son, the boy who once built birdhouses and fixed radios, had uncovered something dangerous. I could almost see him here, pacing the floor, piecing it together. The realization came with a wave of guilt so sharp, it nearly took me to my knees. I should have seen it. The worry in his eyes, the distance in his voice. I thought he was just tired, maybe overworked. But he had been terrified, and I hadn't noticed. I sat back against the wall, the box open beside me, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. The silence pressed harder now. The truth was no longer abstract. It had a pulse. My grief, my denial, all of it was burning away into something else, anger. And then, just as I started to gather the papers, I heard it, a crunch outside. Slow, careful, like a footstep on gravel. My body went rigid. I turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and waited. Another sound. the faint creak of the porch step. Someone was out there, watching. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, listening to the wind scrape across the old boards. My fear settled into resolve. Whoever had silenced Ethan thought they'd buried the truth with him. But they were wrong. I wasn't leaving. Not until I knew everything my son died trying to tell me. It started with the sound of tires on gravel. Slow, deliberate. I froze where I stood, every nerve awake. The clock on the wall ticked like a heartbeat, the farmhouse holding its breath along with me. Headlights cut across the window for a brief second, then darkness again. I knew that car. I didn't even have to look. The front door creaked open. My body went cold. I told myself to move, to hide, to do something. But I just stood there, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles ached. Her footsteps echoed through the hall, soft but certain. The sound of someone who already knows they belong in a place they shouldn't. When she stepped into the room, her perfume arrived first, faint vanilla and smoke. Then her voice, sweet and low, pretending softness. I turned slowly, trying to steady my breath, forcing my face into something that didn't show the storm inside me. Seeing her there made my stomach twist. She looked exactly as she did at the funeral, composed, immaculate, and entirely wrong for the moment. She said something, words that were supposed to sound kind, but all I heard was the hum of danger beneath them. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering a moment too long on the table where Ethan's notebook still lay open. I caught her glance, and for the first time, I saw something real flicker across her face. Not grief, not shock, recognition. I tried to stay calm, but my heartbeat was a drum against my ribs. Every instinct told me to run, yet I found myself standing taller instead. I could feel her studying me, waiting to see if I'd flinch. I didn't. I thought about the photographs in the box, the bank records, the way Ethan had written her name over and over like a warning. Something shifted then, a silence that wasn't empty but charged. I saw it in her posture, in the way her smile tightened just a fraction too much. The mask she wore began to crack. Behind it, I glimpsed something hard, something cruel, and in that moment, I knew. My son's death hadn't been an accident. She had known about his investigation. Maybe she'd even helped end it. The realization hit me like a wave of ice, but underneath the fear, something else began to burn. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't the grieving mother she thought I was. I was his mother still, and I had nothing left to lose. The farmhouse seemed to close in around us, the air thick with everything unspoken. I felt my hands stop trembling. I could almost hear Ethan's voice in the back of my mind, urging me not to be afraid. I met her eyes and, for the first time, didn't look away. Whatever game she thought she was playing, it was over. She could threaten, lie, manipulate, but I had the truth now, and that was something she couldn't bury. When she finally turned toward the door, muttering something under her breath, I didn't follow. I just stood there, steady, my pulse beginning to slow, because deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. She'd be back, or someone would. And when they came, I'd be ready. I didn't sleep that night, After Lila left, the farmhouse felt colder, not just from the chill in the air, but from the weight of everything unsaid. I sat by the lamp for hours, staring at the box on the table, Ethan's handwriting spilling across the pages like a map of his last days. My heart wouldn't settle. Something in me kept whispering that I hadn't found everything yet, that there was more he'd meant for me to see. It was close to 2:30 a.m. when I finally stood and began pacing the floor. Every creak beneath my feet felt like a breadcrumb. I traced my hand along the wall, past the photographs, past the old mantel where Ethan used to line up toy cars when he was little. I remembered how he used to hide things from me. Candy, little inventions, sometimes just notes that said "found me again." Mom, that memory stopped me cold. Found me again. I crouched down and ran my hand along the baseboard behind the fireplace. One section of wood sounded different when I tapped it, hollow, faintly metallic beneath. My pulse quickened. I pulled at the panel until it gave way, revealing a small safe set into the wall, its surface coated in dust. The keypad blinked faintly when I brushed it off. I stared at it, the memory of Ethan's childhood code echoing in my mind. His birthday and mine, always together. My fingers trembled as I entered it. The lock clicked open. Inside were folders stacked neatly, a flash drive, a small handgun, and a sealed envelope with my name written on it. I don't know how long I sat there before opening it. My eyes caught the first line, Ethan's handwriting again. But it wasn't a letter. It was a set of instructions, coordinates, and contact names. My breath caught as I unfolded the next document, an FBI case file bearing his name. He hadn't just been investigating Lila. He'd been working with federal agents. The flash drive contained recordings. I connected it to an old laptop from his workbench. A video flickered to life, and there he was, my son, alive. He looked tired, but calm, his voice steady, explaining everything. How he'd discovered Lila's connection to an organized ring, how his safety had been compromised, how faking his death was the only way to protect me and bring them down. He spoke with a kind of peace I hadn't seen in years, the peace of someone doing the right thing, even at the highest cost. And then, near the end, his voice softened. He said that if I was watching, it meant I'd found him, that he knew I would. Tears blurred the screen. My hands covered my mouth as a sound escaped me. Not quite a sob, not quite laughter. The ache I'd carried for months cracked open, replaced by something fierce and bright. He was alive. My boy was alive. For a long time. I just sat there in the glow of the screen, breathing, shaking, whispering thank you to no one and everyone at once. My grief didn't disappear, but it changed shape, from loss into purpose. I finally understood what he had wanted me to do. When I closed the safe again, I felt steady. Whatever happened next, I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was the keeper of his truth, and I was going to finish what Ethan started. The farmhouse was so quiet, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. I sat at the old desk, Ethan's files spread out before me, the glow of the lamp flickering across the papers. My fingers hovered over the phone, ready to call the number he'd written in his note, his FBI contact. The air around me felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter everything. Then, a noise outside. Tires again. This time fast, urgent. My heart stuttered. For one terrible moment, I thought it was Lila, that she'd come back to finish what she started. I turned off the lamp and stood still in the dark. The only sound, the quick, shallow rhythm of my own breathing. A flash of light swept across the curtains. Another, brighter this time. And then, voices, dozens of them. Sharp commands, radios crackling, the crunch of boots on gravel. Red and blue lights spilled across the walls. I opened the door slowly, blinking against the sudden brightness. Agents in dark jackets fanned out across the yard, moving with precision. One of them turned toward me, his expression steady, professional. But there was something in his eyes. Recognition. Relief. He spoke into his radio, and everything began to move faster. They had come for Lila. I stood frozen as two black cars pulled up behind the others. Lila's voice broke the night, high and frantic, her hands raised as agents closed in. She tried to talk her way out, but the evidence had already spoken. Watching her there, cornered, powerless, I didn't feel triumph, just an overwhelming sense of release. The weight I'd carried for so long finally began to lift. And then, through the chaos, I heard it. My name. Soft at first, almost lost in the noise. But I knew that voice. I would have known it anywhere. I turned, and there he was. Ethan. He looked different, leaner, older. His eyes lined with things I couldn't yet understand. But it was him. Alive. The air left my lungs in one long, trembling breath. My knees went weak, but I didn't fall. I just stood there, watching him walk toward me, each step both real and impossible. When he reached me, I didn't run or cry out. I simply touched his face, needing to feel what my eyes couldn't believe. Warm, solid, alive. All the words I'd kept inside for months dissolved before I could say them. He just nodded, his eyes shining in the flashing light, and I knew he had done it. He had survived it all. In that moment, every sleepless night, every question, every ounce of pain found its place. The farmhouse, the secrets, the fear, it had all led here to this single, trembling heartbeat of truth. When the agents led Lila away, the world around us finally went quiet again. The lights dimmed, the radios faded, and the night returned to stillness. I stood beside Ethan, the cold air brushing my face, and for the first time since his death, his pretend death, I could breathe. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It settled softly, like dawn after a storm. I looked at him and whispered in my mind that I forgave everything. The lies, the fear, the distance. Because he was home. Because love had brought us both through the dark. The morning after everything ended, the world felt strangely quiet, as if it, too, needed time to breathe again. I remember stepping outside just as the first light touched the fields behind the farmhouse. The air was cold, clean, and still. Dew clung to the grass, sparkling in the dawn like tiny promises. For the first time in months, I didn't feel that familiar ache in my chest. Only peace, fragile but real. Ethan was safe. Lila was gone, and I was still standing. There's something that happens after you've walked through fear for too long. You begin to understand how strength isn't loud. It isn't about fighting harder. It's about staying when it would be easier to run. I used to think grief was something to escape, a darkness that would swallow me whole if I let it get too close. But I was wrong. Grief, I've learned, is love that refuses to disappear. It changes shape, but it never leaves. When I lost Ethan, or thought I had, I kept asking why life could be so cruel. Now I see that sometimes truth takes the long way home. His death broke me open in ways I never expected. But through that breaking, I found parts of myself I didn't know were still alive. Courage, patience, and faith. Not faith in something divine, necessarily, but in the quiet belief that love always leads us back to what matters. Looking at him now, alive, stronger, changed, I don't just see my son. I see every moment of hope I ever whispered into the dark, every prayer I never said out loud, and I realize that survival isn't just about living through pain. It's about choosing to trust again once the storm passes. I've forgiven everything, even myself, the fear, the doubt, the anger, because life doesn't ask us to be perfect. It asks us to keep going, to keep believing that love is still worth the risk. If you've ever lost someone or faced something that made you question everything you knew, I hope my story reminds you that even the deepest pain can lead somewhere beautiful. That truth, no matter how heavy, can set you free. Thank you for listening to mine. Have you ever faced something that changed the way you see love or loss? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and if this story found its way to your heart, maybe share it with someone who needs a little light today.